You've got to ask yourself, why do people take this particular substance? And I don't mean to be offensive, but on the street, people will tell you that it makes you feel good. It makes you, as they say, you can drink like a fish, party like an animal, and fuck like a horse. And that's, in the moment, that seems like real fun. The only thing is, you've just lit a fuse that, whether it's a slow-burning fuse or a fast-burning fuse, you're going to destroy yourself.
We all know only too well of the scourge methamphetamine is causing to families and communities up and down our country through the many P-fueled murders and violent crimes that have occurred in recent times. That level of social disruption is completely unacceptable, and we have to do all we can across many disciplines and using all of the border security, policing and general enforcement, health and social services agencies that are available to us to rid our country of this plague.
People I've known who've been involved in drugs, I have never seen anything like this drug, for Māori anyway, which actually switches off their connection to tikanga.
I used methamphetamine and got sucked into that whole trip. But like many of the stories here that you've heard, we often get touched by something that happens in our life. And the thing that sort of woke me up was the death of a very good leader called Honi Day, who killed himself in a most dramatic fashion and sort of caused us to think about what this particular substance was doing.
I tried methamphetamine a couple of times, never really got into it, was always very against it. I'd watch people go downhill very fast on the stuff, and I said, no, that's not for me, I'd stand at my high and mighty point, I'm a party drug user, there's nothing wrong with that, it's fine, I'm not smoking pee, which was a joke. Someone mentioned stigmas before, I experienced a stigma within a stigma.
People who are affected by drug problems are marginalised more than many other sectors of the community. And so one of the issues is that we must help people recognise that it is legitimate to respond to people with drug problems. Or the other way we can do with it is to say, well, we're not going to help people with drug problems as long as we do the same because they've brought it on themselves. As long as we do the same for people who eat too many pies and people who climb mountains and fall off them and silly buggers who go out in yachts and need rescued.
Because in this country there's such a huge passion about meth, about P, that any drug discussion is automatically linked to a P discussion, which then takes it out of the realm of being able to assess proper harms and deal with the issues as they need to be dealt with.
What do you do when you want to know something? Well, you go out and ask the people. Go out and ask the people what's going down. And so we went and talked to prostitutes. We got gang leaders together. We went to health workers. We went around the country and we got some feedback. And we started to come to some notions. And the first notion was that when you get a substance like this, we get frightened about it and we want to attack. In our fear and in our lack of knowledge, we want to make the war on.
When you talk about the offenses that bring the longest sentences, the drugs that we're afraid of, like crack in our country, methamphetamine here, well then the disparities in prosecutions become even starker, because it's like the harsher the punishment, the more likely it's going to be imposed on young people and on people of color. We ought to have some real pause about being part of a global system that does that in almost every country, that targets the weakest, not because they're the ones who are most guilty, not because they're the ones who are the most involved in law breaking, but because it's easy.
Not every Muslim is a terrorist, and not every priest is a pedophile, and not every policeman has a propensity for group sex, and not every gang member makes or is involved with methamphetamine. But to some degree, the international traders in methamphetamine and its precursors have colonised the brown gangs as a distribution mules.
Cannabis and beer are the drugs of choice in the youth court, not pee, thankfully, because I think, putting it in as balanced a way as I can, if pee became a feature and was endemic in drug use amongst young people, we would face a social catastrophe.
It's very long bow to suggest that drug users who end up in prison do so because of a failure of drug policy. The truth is, many of them have deep and complex social and intellectual developmental problems. If we're looking to pin their offending on a failure, we should perhaps look at failures in parenting, early childhood health and education, rather than drugs policy. Most importantly, we need to disavow ourselves of any delusion that drug addicts in prisons are all the likes of Millie Holmes, nice middle-class white kids who got, or nice middle-class kids, sorry, who got mixed up with the wrong crowd and got in too deep, or kids whose university substance experimentation got out of hand and derailed a promising PhD. If we want to reduce criminality around drug use to any noticeable degree, we're not going to do it by encouraging kids from the leafy suburbs to make healthier choices.
Amphetamine use, simply put, a lot of people will say, screws up your relationships. So if we don't have clinicians who are able to establish and create relationships, we're not likely to retain people in treatment. And in fact, the treatment literature tells us, in the drug field and in others, we're not very successful at retaining people in treatment. And if we don't retain them in treatment, we can't have a treatment impact.
I think law enforcement experience in New Zealand and overseas show the only way to make a big dent in the abuse of drugs is to do real damage to the supply chain. That means primarily taking out the organised crime syndicates that control the drugs trade. They need to be targeted at every level, from the street level distributors right back up to the cooks and importers, and most critical of all, the groups who control the huge sums of money that link the chain together. Law enforcement experience also shows that the worst thing we can do is half police the problem.
It was mentioned before about if things don't get better, then why bother? Things didn't get better. You know, my first 2 months prior to treatment, I wanted to die. It was horrible. The drugs didn't work. Being sober didn't work. What do you do in a situation like that? You know, hence the treatment came in. You know, and I came out of that treatment centre on the 31st of December 2007. You know, and since then it's been, to say the least, a bumpy ride. A very bumpy ride. But it's brought me here today, you know.